Today I'm here with Geoff Shullenberger. Geoff is the founder of the Outsider Theory blog, as well as a senior lecturer at NYU's expository writing program. Geoff, welcome to the Agora Politics podcast.
Thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
It's great. It's great to have you on. I'm really excited to get into some of the things that I think we're going to talk about today. So right off the bat, I want you to tell me about this Outsider Theory project that you're doing in your spare time. What it means to you, and what you think is going on with it.
Sure. So it really it became a way for me to bring together a couple of areas of interest that I maybe previously understood as separate areas of curiosity. Mm-hmm. But that it turns out that outsider theory is sort of a useful term for all of them. And so they may still be somewhat separate, but at the same time, they all kind of belong under that heading. So the first one is conspiracy theory, basically, as it's usually called. So it's, sort of unauthorized intellectual activity that often gets put under that heading. And, the sort of quality of that, not unlike the quality of sort of legitimate academic theory, varies considerably. But, there is a good amount of production in there that is at least highly fascinating and deserves careful attention and interest. Mm-hmm. And, conspiracy theory is a term that was really devised as a way of kind of dismissing or being able to disqualify a lot of that sort of thought. And, that's not to say that, clearly some of what gets put under that heading probably should be, but I still want to have a more curious attitude towards that kind of stuff. And maybe we can get into why I think that later on. But sure. So that's one element. Another element is I've been very interested in how basically this body of writing and thinking that's often called theory or French theory, which is essentially the kind of structuralist to post-structuralist sort of efflorescence of kind of radical and quite original and unique thinking that came out of France in the 60s and 70s particularly, and then was gradually kind of, if you read Francois Cousset's book, French Theory, it's kind of about how that was not really a unified thing until it came to the United States and kind of became understood as that, right? In its original context, it was not really understood as all being part of the same thing. But what I'm interested in is how that kind of body of work is sort of transmitted into other realms, and particularly non-academic realms, and how it kind of mutates and evolves when it sort of escapes the confines of the academy in particular. Mm-hmm. So basically, so you can sort of see how those two are potentially convergent because, in some cases, I think there is a kind of paranoid element of a lot of that kind of theory. And so there's a kind of interesting way that it can converge with the conspiratorial under the heading of a kind of popularized hermeneutic of suspicion. Mm-hmm. And then the third element really comes out of one of the French theorists I've been most engaged with, who's René Girard, and his theory of the scapegoat, as this figure who is the outsider and who in some way helps constitute a community by standing outside of it and sort of being expelled or marginalized by it, but in that sense becomes the kind of linchpin by which its unity is achieved. So those are really the three kind of facets of the project, and they all kind of overlap and interact with each other. But that's basically the sort of somewhat eclectic but thematically unified project.
Okay, so those are great, and I'd love to get into each of those points. But for right now, I guess one of the higher level questions that I have for you, just personally, is obviously there's this sort of, I guess, general theory of the outside, right? Marginalized ideas, marginalized figures, people who are a little bit too close to the edge in their thinking, or even dangerous, you might say, in various ways, or dangerous ideas as in conspiracy theories, etc. But you yourself are someone who's decidedly on the inside in your capacity as a lecturer at NYU. So how do you view your, I guess, decision to pursue that endeavor? And do you think that it actually is something that's outside the confines of normal academic life?
That's a good question. So standard, professional ambitions of the academic. My position at NYU is such that I'm teaching my my sort of evaluation and promotion. I mean, I'm on multi-year contracts and I am full-time, but is not based on what I write. It's really based on my teaching and sort of service to the university. And so as a result of that, I have a certain amount of freedom because I'm not expected to publish any particular kind of thing. Like there's sort of a value placed on just being active as a writer, as an intellectual, but I'm not really evaluated on that. And in a sense, the university doesn't really care what exactly I write, or who I write it for, or anything like that. So that's a certain amount of freedom I have through that relative marginality, which, the cost of which is like I'm not getting paid as well. I don't have the same level of job security, although I'm better off than the average adjunct. But it does afford a certain amount of freedom to not really care about academic professionalization and to, just do things that are a bit weirder and maybe wouldn't be all that valued, but that, in a sense, allow me to pursue things that are more interesting to me. And to be honest, have a much wider readership than I did. I mean, I have a much wider readership for my blog than I ever did for any of the sort of peer-reviewed articles that I wrote. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's, the value you get out of engaging in the academic publication game is a kind of is one where you're essentially accumulating sort of markers of prestige, but you're not, the sort of communities, or I wouldn't even call them that, the sort of subgroups and specializations are so siloed that, just very few people read anything that you write for those kind of publications. And, you can go to the conferences and things like that, but to me, it's a lot more interesting to just write weird stuff that like all sorts of weirdos on the internet find, and that, they get me into conversations with like people who have nothing in common with me professionally or, in terms of my training, but who do share certain of these interests. Like that's a great deal more interesting to me and sort of intellectually stimulating than just kind of going to conferences where I'm like presenting to the sort of 25 people who like roughly fall into the same area of specialization as me. Like that's just not really that interesting to me anymore.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of your work and your writing focuses on various dynamics, subcommunities, cultures that appear on the internet. And one of the things that I think is interesting about that is that I think a lot of the material and the popularization of ideas that were once sort of out of bounds or rather obscure or marginalized in various ways is a result of their proliferation on the internet. How do you see the internet tied into sort of this, what I view as like this new age of blossoming intellectualism and sort of ideas? It's almost like they escaped the academy, right? Like they weren't supposed to get out, and now they're out kind of spreading around. And I view that, in terms of the proliferation of different political ideologies, the fact that no one can seem to have a common ground to talk about, values or even political identification anymore, because of the fact that there's just so many groups and subgroups and different, factions that arise. I view all of that as a sort of revealed preferences type situation. That's a result of the expansion of knowledge created by the internet. How do you think about the internet in terms of the role in your project?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that that's, it was a huge thing for me to discover, just that I could go directly to the general public online and just discover a critical mass of people who are interested in the kind of stuff I was interested in.
Mm.
So definitely that played a pivotal role in shifting my emphasis in terms of what I write and who I write for. So yeah, it's a huge factor. I think the disadvantages of it are that, I mean, a couple that relate to things that, so I've started an interview podcast as well. That's a spinoff of my blog that's recently launched.
Mhm.
So people can check that out. It's, you find it on the same website as the blog, but I've interviewed a couple people who kind of had some interesting insights related to this. Those episodes are not yet released, but so one of them was about fashion. Was talking to somebody who thinks about how fashion is shaped by this kind of subcultural, like, niche sorting that takes place on social media platforms. So you have all the different core. You have cottagecore and you have whatever core. Um, and how there is a kind of so it seems like one of the effects of these platforms is it creates those kind of sorting effects, and you see that in style and fashion, right, where
Mm.
people are constantly trying to differentiate themselves, and so you end up with this this kind of sort of exponential proliferation of different niches. And so the bad thing about that is that it creates all of these niches of people who are kind of defined by, like, hating other people, and it
Yeah, I feel
creates a
like
lot of it creates a lot of obstacle, at least, whatever, in the context of this kind of fashion, people just like inventing these new styles and things like that. Maybe, I think my interlocutor for that thought there was something quite negative about that. I think it's even worse in the realm of ideas, because it means that just these ways that people, try to, in the attention economy, kind of project some sort of distinct identity, just become this basis of a lot of sort of trivial conflict and feuds and fighting. So I think that's an aspect of it that is maybe the negative side of it.
mm,
Another aspect, which is kind of both good and bad, is that another person I interviewed, is one of the, like, Theorygram people who produces these theory memes. So there is this kind of quite sort of overtly superficial engagement with theory, which I'm
mm,
interested in as a phenomenon, but
okay.
it does it does maybe make sometimes the possibility of dialogue a bit shallow, in terms of what's possible. Despite the sort of seeming traction that a lot of these ideas have, the way in which they're consumed is this hyper accelerated and hyper simplified kind of meme form.
Okay.
So I don't know.
So
Those are two things that are maybe like the darker side of it.
in terms of this relationship between ideas and theory and that is, continental theory or French theory, whatever you want to call it, and this idea of conspiracy. It sounds like, from both the comments you made so far today, as well as other, I guess, um, espousings I've heard from you online, that, when you're talking about this sort of surface level reproduction of theory, or flirtation with theory, or oftentimes it's presented as a kind of like exposition of it. Um, do you think that there's sort of conspiratorial thinking with regard to the proliferation of these academic ideas, or were you talking more about conspiratorial thinking internal to the logic of those theories, or both?
I mean, I would say, this term hermeneutic of suspicion is the one I would use here. Part of what I would say is that there's a kind of, and I'm writing something that's related to this. So to be very schematic, this term hermeneutic of suspicion comes from Paul Ricoeur. Paul Ricoeur's Freud and Philosophy. And, it describes this kind of sensibility that is associated with Marx, Freud, and, to some extent, Darwin would probably fall under that category too. And the idea of it is that, to oversimplify a lot, that there's a surface level of reality that has to be treated with distrust. And then, what the task of analysis is to kind of reach beneath that and find some kind of deep mover or some structure that accounts for the working of the surface level of reality. So anyway, the hermeneutic of suspicion is kind of the sort of the point from which all of the French theory departs to some extent or another, right? Although you could argue that in some forms it actually became a sort of critique of that surface and depth structure. But in any case, to some extent or another, it's all coming out of Freud and Marx, right? And so what you have is that sort of way that intellectual life is infused with that particular sensibility. And then kind of simultaneously with that, you have the rise of sort of popular conspiracy culture, which I would say is kind of and I would trace both of these ultimately to a sort of mediatic, like the sort of intuitiveness and popularity of this mode of thinking. I understand in terms of the kind of mediatic regime of the 20th century. I'm sort of influenced by Friedrich Kittler in his work on this, but basically, so you have the highbrow version, let's say, and then you have the sort of lowbrow version, right? The highbrow version is theory, the lowbrow version is conspiracy theory. And then I think sort of what you have is on the highbrow end, you have a kind of falling into disrepute of the sort of hermeneutic of suspicion. So you have a lot of this idea of post-critique starting around the beginning of the 20th century. And that seems to be informed by a recognition that the hermeneutic of suspicion is now the dominant frame of the entire culture, right? It's no longer this thing that distinguishes you as an intellectual who sees through what the sort of, dupes and rubes of the general populace can't see, right? In fact, it's the dupes and rubes who are themselves the most suspicious, right? So you have a sort of watershed essay by Bruno Latour called "Why Has Critique Run Out of Steam?" And this is really the parting point of it, right? What he says is essentially that the problem, he and all of his sort of French theory contemporaries were trained to believe that what you needed to do was to critique the sort of naive surface level understanding of reality that the sort of average citizen had imbibed from the sort of mediatic brainwashing machine, right? And get past that. But his position, writing in about 2004, is that, in fact, the suspicious idea that all of that is this rank propaganda that needs to be that we need to look past is actually now the sort of standard view of the average person, right? And so he describes living in a village in France, and his sort of neighbor who like never didn't go to college is like making fun of him for being so naive as to believe that the 9/11 attacks really happened as the government says, right? And so I think there's a kind of so there's this the hermeneutic of suspicion is becomes so popularized and so set into all dimensions of popular culture, meme space, etc., left and right, doesn't matter, that in fact there's a kind of withdrawal of the intellectuals from that and an attempt to and to me the most the clearest example of this now is COVID, right? So what do we have? Well, we have basically these random anons doing this kind of folk Foucauldian critique of biopolitics, right? And then we have these sort of blue check academics being like, believe in science, etc. So it's a remarkable transformation, and I think the COVID moment has been a real revelatory one for this process. So that's pretty much how I see it. Probably oversimplifying a little bit, but